Good morning, everyone. It's great to address you again here today. Yesterday, of course, we did the updates from LACNIC, and today I really wanted to save anything dealing with IPv6 for this particular session. So I think we will see some interesting things along the way, some things that would provoke thought a bit. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we could have after my presentation. I would state, first of all, categorically that I am reporting on this initiative. I've been involved in parts of initiative, but of course, I'm always here to facilitate some of the more poignant questions you may have in terms of methodology and other details you may want to get. So the presentation is up. We're going to look, of course, okay, I guess, a bit of, right. Great. We're going to have just a quick snapshot about LACNIC again, and then we're going to go straight into some of these details regarding IPv6. Obviously, we'd have seen this yesterday. I think Mark Costas would have shown this map about the RIRs, the Regional Internet Registries, and we are aware that ARIN covers North America and parts of the Caribbean, and LACNIC covers Latin America and another part of the Caribbean. When we are trying to look at the Caribbean, or when we look at the Caribbean, I should say, this year just gives us a good sense as to what our end user populations look like. So for instance, these are the latest available stats on internet users per population. On the figure at the left is the total population, and figure at the right is the internet users per population. And we will see within the Caribbean we have some more advanced economies, including Aruba registering 88.6. We would see as well some high stats coming from French Guyana. Another high ranking stat here is Trinidad and Tobago with 69.2. Unfortunately, I have not been able to include Barbados and a couple other countries in this base simply because it was catered to the LACNIC part of the Caribbean. There are some pockets. So for instance, it's a bit difficult for us in LACNIC to disaggregate what occurs in the Best Islands, that is Bonaire, St. Eustatius, and Saba. But we were able to try and get some proxies. I'm still waiting on collecting data from these territories to find out exactly what their internet scenario looks like, their end user count. So, next. All right. I think I may need some assistance in getting to the next slide. Okay. What I wanted to show you next deals with the IPv6 measurement on a global scale. Are we able to see that just yet? Okay. So IPv6 on a global scale. And what the statistic will actually show, it looks at IPv6 capable rate. So in other terms, looking at the availability of IPv6 to the end user in proportion to total internet traffic. At this moment, it stands at about 10, right. Okay, just back one slide. Right, at this moment, it stands at about 10.95% of total internet traffic, and this actually shows a 113% increase since this time last year. I guess we'll just continue. And who is contributing to this global statistic? This table here, okay. I know, we'll work it through, That's why we're here at Caribnog. This table here just shows the top 20 IPv6 economies that we have in the world, and it shows you those are attributed to this IPv6 capable rate of 10.95 throughout the world. And we will see some of our top economies included Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, etc., 53.95, 43.66. But I wanted to draw your attention to where we start registering Latin American and Caribbean countries. We have Ecuador registering at 18.02, Peru with 17.5, and none other in 19th place, our own Caribbean island, Trinidad and Tobago at 15.01. So what this points to, next, is that in all honesty, there are several ways to measure IPv6 adoption. So you have some methodologies that look at the prefixes, IPv6 prefixes that are announced on global routing tables. You also look at IPv6 announced with ASNs. So there are several methodologies, and here is just a compendium of some of the most common ones that we see, looking at various elements of how we measure IPv6 adoption. One of them, which has been fascinating me for the longest while, next slide, is this here. I hope you can see it well. It's the Akamai State of the Internet visualization, which actually ranked Trinidad and Tobago at 3rd place about a month or so back, and now it's at 6th place. But what we could say about this is that, and this is 6th in the world in terms of IPv6 deployment, but what we could say about that is that Akamai actually just measures the hits based on what they see on countries that use Akamai as their CDN. So to say that there's a holistic view of what IPv6 adoption is, it tends to vary according to the source of your information. And I just found this really interesting because although it has a particular methodology associated to it, it's quite significant in its own right in terms of seeing the Caribbean ranking in this case and within the top 10 of the IPv6 economies in the world. Okay, and great. So, zero in on IPv6 in Latin America. What we did at LACNIC is that in 2015, we decided to undertake a more detailed study about the socioeconomic factors surrounding IPv6 deployment. Why is it that it's still low in some parts of the region, and what can be done to improve this deployment? So this was a 10-month investigation that we conducted in 2015, and this study itself, it comprised of 3 parts. On the one hand, we did surveys among our LACNIC members to address where they were in terms of their IPv6 deployment. We also came up with a very customized IPv6 indicator, what we call ICAV6. This IPv6 indicator, it leverages Cisco's methodology for measuring various stages of the internet value chain. And what we did at LACNIC is that we assigned a particular weighting system to what we will call the planned or the actual state of IPv6 deployment and what was projected to happen. And I will explain a bit what that means in a short while. We also had samples from 10 countries. And in these 10 countries, we went there and we interviewed various stakeholders. So not only ISPs, we also looked at stakeholders who were responsible for major deployment of infrastructure. And this will include a number of public stakeholders, universities, research networks, and the like. And also, with this, we included a dynamic financial model. This dynamic financial model is intended for operators to be able to put in various parameters in terms of where they are in their IPv6 deployment and to actually get monetary values to understand the benefits or the disadvantages of one particular strategy versus another. So we look at this in more details. Finally, what this research uncovered was a number of best practices, guidelines that we also published along in the document, and that way this will help any other operator that is interested in undertaking some form of IPv6 deployment but is a bit uncertain as to how to go about doing so. So looking at the ICAV6, the ICAV6, it comprises 4 sub-indicators, and the sub-indicators are what I mentioned, refer to certain parts of the value chain. The first one, PACTO, it looks at the IPv6 allocated prefixes with observed traffic with respect to the total allocations. So this is very interesting in LACNIC because, as I mentioned yesterday, since 2012, we had a policy that stated that once you're requesting V4 space, you also had to request V6 space, regardless of whether you had an addressing plan and clear business requirements for that V6 space. So what this here is looking at with PACTO, it looks at those that are actually using IPv6 resources already among what they would have received within the period of 2012 onwards. Right. The next pillar, which looks at observed ASNs with IPv6 traffic with respect to the total number of ASNs. We also have the content pillar, which looks at the sum of IPv6 accessible sites. And then we also have the user pillar, which looks at the availability of IPv6 to the end user. The weighting system that we used, we assigned 30% for the planning stages, which are the first 2, because the first 2 speak to IPv6 you would have in hand already. And we also looked at assigning 70% to the last 2 indicators. And the last 2 indicators are really dependent on user patterns. So for instance, content, which was developed using Alexa, you would see that it registers very high values because what that shows in essence is that a lot of the end users not only in the Caribbean, within the entire region, they tend to access content off of websites that have already IPv6 enabled. When you looked at those websites where you would typically see Google services, Facebook, Akamai, the major CDNs in the world where we know that IPv6 has already been deployed and is on full time. And this here is just a preview of the results that we undertook for the LACNIC economies. Basically, any of the economies that you see registering ICAV6 value higher than 20% is very interesting. What we do see is that there are some nil values, and the nil values are just based on some of the challenges we have had in collecting this aggregate data at certain economies. But some of the significant ones you will see, for instance, is Ecuador registering 48.82 based on this methodology. We have Guatemala with 33.2, TNT 38.24, etc. So out of this, one of the things that we noticed is that there are roughly only about 4 countries that actually have more than 1% of their end users ready for IPv6. And out of these 4 countries, Ecuador, Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, we see that most of the ISPs, they're still not offering IPv6 to their end users, but they're using it at some point along of their infrastructure. In most cases, it's within their core network. Since the study had been done, Belize had been registering high values above 1% available to their end users. And also Trinidad and Tobago as well has registered more than 1% of their traffic, IPv6, available to their end users. 30% of the organizations were thinking about deploying IPv6 in 2016. Most common strategy, dual stack with native IPv6 and private IPv4 CGN 44. So we'll see an example of what that strategy is in a minute. And of course, countries with large internet penetration are the ones that are most delayed for IPv6 uptake, right? And the feeling is that there's enough IPv4 stock to service their current needs, because at this point you still have this paradigm where people are requesting resources simply based on their customer base and what their customer needs are. So you're looking at possibly residential customers with 1 to 3 devices, home networks, so a lot of NATing occurring. But of course, when it comes to IPv6, we have to realize that that is not the parameters that we look at in terms of how IPv6 is developing across the world. There's a significant amount of development in terms of where content lies, and that is one of the things that we have to take into consideration, especially when we think about the quality of internet services that we will start seeing effects to those internet services in the future. More findings that the so-called IPv6 ready CPEs were not IPv6. So you do have CPEs, but switch out of CPEs at operators. But what was found is that not many of them had been configured for announcing IPv6. Customer premise equipment. Sorry. Interestingly, I'm going to segue a bit here. I was just in another session, hence the switch in the agenda, dealing with reporting, and it was said that you always need to explain your jargon despite your audience because you're never quite certain as to what jargon is commonly known or not. Provisioning systems, internal business support system software, with IPv6 and operations, not a big issue, but of course there's still an ongoing need to train technicians with understanding IPv6, how to deploy it within their networks, and how to provide service to developers and other high-end users of IPv6. Within the research networks, the national research networks, we had some IPv6 deployed, but there was some problems. Problems included Wi-Fi, firewalls not supporting IPv6. I know of situations here with some of our academic institutions where there's IPv6 to a certain extent, but when it comes to their bring your own device initiatives, what is available to the end user at the last mile is not necessarily IPv6. And governments, e-government systems, government portals, typically did not support IPv6 across the region. So now we're going to look at the case of Peru, which is one of the nice examples that we have of IPv6 transition. Peru right now registers an IPv6 capable rate of 19.1. What you will see is that this drop here is probably just turned off all the IPv6 in the country. But what you would see with the variations at times across economies is that a lot of it is attributed to testing and other factors that they do. And for the most part, Peru has this as what you would call their permanently enabled traffic. And when we look at Peru and we try to consider who are the main contributors to Peru's reference value, we will see these ASNs being registered as high. The main contributor in this case happens to be Telefónica del Perú, which is basically the incumbent in Peru, and we will look a bit as to what Telefónica had done. We have others in the environment, but Telefónica has contributed to Peru's IPv6 development in a significant way. And what happened at Telefónica is that in 2008, they had a shortage of IPv4 addresses. So they had a customer base of, let's say, roughly 1.4, and they only had 1.6 IPv4 addresses. Sorry, I think I have it the other way around. They had a customer base of 1.6 and only 1.4 IPv4 addresses. So they decided to do some planning and involve all parts of the company, not only the technical department, but they also included the marketing and operations department to understand what they wanted to undertake in this planning. So they started testing in 2010, and then what we see later on is that in their AHFC networks, they deployed it in 2016, that is current, and they're planning to deploy it in 2017 in mobile networks. But in the meantime, what they had done is that they used CGN. They had some corporate users using DSL to get public IPs, but their mobile networks, they use CGNs. And of course, they had no problems with their business support systems. Their provisioning systems were part of the plan. And in case of the help desk, their help desk staff are well equipped to treat with queries and troubleshooting with both IPv4 and IPv6. But this is just from the operator perspective. What we have to look at in Peru is that there were other actors involved, including the government. So there were two main offices, the E-Government Office of Peru and another office dealing with ICT development in the country. They use their regulations to mandate that one, all equipment, CPEs, any equipment that the operators needed had to come IPv6 configured. And also, they mandated that all installations within public infrastructure had to support IPv6. That is what they had done in their regulatory space. And we also had the universities undertaking their own deployments. And in addition to just deploying IPv6, the universities conducted a sensitization campaign, not only involving the technology departments, they also involved the other departments of the university, the creative arts, etc., to explain what IPv6 was and the benefits of using IPv6. And just naturally, in how the country is set up, there were a lot of cross-departmental collaborations in dealing with developing content and mainly developing advanced content for the Peruvian internet community. Sorry. And here, Trinidad and Tobago, with its reference value of 17.21. And again, we see some variations which are attributed to testing and other activities. And in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, when we look at their ASN, so this is the leaderboard for Trinidad and Tobago, there is one that attributes very much to Trinidad's statistics, which is Digicel Jamaica. So ASN for Digicel Jamaica being observed within Trinidad and Tobago and with IPv6 capable. There are a couple of others. Yes, so that's part of the discussion. I hear the whispers. For those who are online, there's a lot of queries about that one. But of course, we have a couple of others that register. So unfortunately, this just shows up to 2 points in terms of the reference value. And there's another column which deals with the sample sizes and a weight that is applied to give you the full gamut of what is being measured in coming up with these leaderboards. But we have some other major contributors on this leaderboard, including Columbus Communications, TSTT, Digicel Trinidad and Tobago, UE Open Campus, etc. So we are moving along now to the economic model, and the economic model is very useful because one of the reactions that we had in conducting this survey is that usually technical departments within the operators and financial departments at the operators, they don't usually understand, or they don't, there's, how should I put it in a diplomatic way? There is less fluent understanding between the two when it comes to making technological decisions. This is what had been observed in general, so this is just a blanket observation across Latin America and the Caribbean. Of course, there are differences and there are exceptions to this, but that was the rationale behind the economic model, or the financial model, I should say. And this financial model, it really anticipates three scenarios where one of the scenarios has an alternative. So that's how we see these four strategies. The first strategy is when you have a provider that's beginning to transition using some IPv6 and dual stacking and CGNAT. But there are two alternatives with this. One alternative is with swapping out all the CPEs, customer premise equipment, and the other alternative is without swapping the CPEs. So we will say in any case, based on our accounting cycles, that the CPEs have to be changed anyway. So this is just showing this very hypothetical scenario where you do have the swapping out of CPEs as per your regular upgrades, and a scenario where you are doing upgrades but you're not swapping out the CPEs. And we have a value that is registered for these two. The second scenario is about using CGNAT without implementing IPv6 whatsoever. So you have an existing pool of IPv4 addresses and you just plan to NAT from here till who knows when. There is a particular value that is attributed to that as well. And then the other scenario deals with still trying to purchase IPv4 addresses without NATing on IPv6 and hoping that the sky doesn't fall. This is what we call the worst case scenario, and there's a value that's attributed to that. So in breaking it down, what this table does is that you can play with some of the parameters. You talk about the opportunity cost of capital. You talk about the number of current residential customers. We talk about the NAT operational capacity and the value that's attributed to that. You can insert whatever parameters that are applicable to you to see what that financial cost of your existing strategy is, and you can also insert potential strategies inside of there and come up with monetary values to demonstrate the benefits of using one strategy versus the other. This tool we have found has been very helpful, as I said, in those scenarios where there's less understanding between technology departments and financial departments or the operators, and it helps understand the need of making this investment and going beyond a yearly budgetary cycle and understanding what the implications would be in the long run. This model as well, it's available on our website. I would state that at this current time it's available in Spanish, but there are plans in the work to have it available as well in English. And in terms of our learned lessons, we have that adjustments to regulatory frameworks and policies are one of the biggest undertakings that could occur to facilitate IPv6 deployment. And there's also a question that arises in terms of regulatory frameworks and IPv6. Typically, when developing ICT policy and legislation, there's one principle that must be adhered to, which deals with technological neutrality in order to future-proof your ICT policy and legislation. So there was, at some point in time globally, arguments about speaking to IPv6 within the regulatory space, and if that would or would not contravene the technological neutrality principle. In fact, it does not contravene it because it's not looking at choosing one protocol or one technology over another in a competitive space. What is happening, in fact, is that the internet is shifting from one protocol to the next, and we will come to that scenario where IPv4 will no longer be used. I cannot stand here today and tell you when that date would be. I don't think anyone could say when that date would be because, for instance, in 4 of the RIRs, we have reached to exhaustion in IPv4. The one RIR that has IPv4 still in significant amounts happens to be LACNIC, but what you do see happening in Africa is that many countries are leapfrogging. They're bypassing IPv4 and they're doing a lot of their deployments using IPv6. So we are going to run both protocols for a while, but of course the scenario is at some point we will be in an IPv6 only world. The support from academic networks and universities is very important when we look at uptake. Your universities, they have to be involved. Those that are any agents that are drivers of innovation in the country, they are some of the most probable causes to see some shift in IPv6. So we can say academic networks, but of course innovation doesn't have to occur in an academic network as well. So where you're seeing that there is innovative activity in the country, you would see that that also pushes this move to IPv6. And the best practice of all is to develop a roadmap to encourage timely transition and include training as part of that transition. Within the LACNIC region, operators, ISPs, and end users, the end users, similar to what Mark explained yesterday, end users in LACNIC refer to universities, IXPs, any entity that is assigned V6 space from the RIR is considered an end user. But I'm talking also as about end users in terms of regular internet users. It's important to develop this transition timely so that it doesn't come as a shock to the organization, to the operator, when undertaking an IPv6 transition strategy. As I said, the typical argument is that between technology and finance that look at things on a yearly cycle. So what you want to do is to plan this transition in advance and see when best to actually deploy certain elements of IPv6, starting most likely at your core network, looking at going to the edge of your network, looking at the equipment, the CPEs, looking at training. It's very important to phase and time this transition properly. What we would see and what has been happening is that there are end users who are starting to see effects to their internet service, and by very nature, the ISPs that do not deploy IPv6, they lose out when end users make their choice and go with the more technologically advantageous companies. Your customers aren't concerned about what's the technology behind it. They have no clue what any of this means. What they do experience is their internet service, and based on that, they will know what choices they need to make to continue enjoying high-quality internet service. And that, you can find all of this information here on our IPv6 portal, IPv6.lacnic.net, including the entire survey and the entire research. And within that research, you can read through some of the stories that were collected among the countries and understand what they did wrong. You actually see that there are some typical problems that we face in the Caribbean that have been reported by other countries. I failed to mention that in this study, we have 2 Caribbean countries that were participating in the in-country fieldwork, and they include Trinidad and Tobago and Dominican Republic. For very practical reasons, within the LACNIC economies, we couldn't include some others, simply because of the feasibility of doing so. And with that, there is one last announcement to make, is that we are looking at another initiative that will bring high value, and of course will speak to this whole question of IPv6 deployment. It may be a bit deterministic to think that IPv6 is required for the Internet of Things to expand, but in most probability, IPv6 is what will help push the Internet of Things forward. And what we are looking at starting now at LACNIC is another research project which deals with governments becoming promoters of the Internet of Things, recommendations for Latin America and the Caribbean. The idea is to look at some of the technical and regulatory requirements for the Internet of Things and to research the socio-economic impacts, There are already some countries that have Internet of Things deployments in verticals, and they include Colombia, Panama, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Peru. So this research is also intended to uncover some of the best practices on the experiences in these countries and to share some of those best practices. And last but not least, the research also includes a sensitization component where we intend to demonstrate these results in a number of spaces, both at the regional and international levels. So this, of course, is one of the underpinnings that we will see for continued IPv6 uptake and use. And this research here will be available in probably 1 year from this time. It has been commissioned. It actually started officially this month. So in 1 year's time, we'll be able to present this report on this issue of governments being promoters of the Internet of Things. And that comes to the end of this presentation. I know it seems as if it was a bit, I know it's a lot to digest, and there are some things that could have been developed more, so this is the time here where I encourage you to ask questions or comments, and we can develop a conversation from there.
Thanks, Kevon. Some really very interesting statistics and yes, Kevon, thank you so much for this presentation. It's good. It's encouraging to see the work that is being done, particularly among the Caribbean. It's a shame that there were just only 2 countries, but again, I guess choices had to be made. We are opening the floor for some questions, and while you don't all rush to the mic, but I will ask the first one while you make your way over. And Kevon, I'm not shooting the messenger, but we've been hearing about IPv6 deployment pre-CaribNOG. Actually, the first time I heard about IPv6 was at the roadshow in St. Kitts in 2010. And I know there has been a lot of work done by the registries to educate people and to speak to them about why we need to move, and even some of the initiatives that you showed here today. But are there any other incentives? Because some of the things that they keep saying is the cost, that it is way too expensive. What incentives are being used, not just by LACNIC, but if you may know of maybe ARIN or RIPE or whatever, that's being used to incentivize this move? Because as you said, we are running out of IPv4
So
addresses.
in my own research, one of the things I notice is that many times there are often events that provoke a transition to IPv6. And this can be dated, I'm going outside of the region to China, for instance, Beijing, when they were looking at the Olympics back in, it's escaping me, I think it was 2010 or so. To look at their security setup, they decided that they needed to deploy IPv6 simply to improve the quality of their feeds. And you can see across the board that there have always been events in Japan as well. They have formed an IPv6 council to also instigate this transition, considering that Japan also includes some of the major equipment manufacturers in the world. There have often been these events that promote it. I don't think only from the operator standpoint they will recognize the value as such, but the customers of the regulators are the ones that usually clamor and show a need to have this environment supported. There's a case of Curacao. It's not documented here, but in Curacao there had been a huge boost to their gaming industry, and not gaming animals, talking about digital games. And and it was really because of that boost you will see a lot of the Curaçaoan internet economy developing. I think, I'm not sure if Claire, you had, at some point you had seen the data centers and the other services that are being offered there. And then Curaçao is developing its internet economy, also offering offshoring possibilities. So it really looks at what your customers are doing, what that shaping up of your internet economy looks like, and therefore you see a thrust towards IPv6. But besides that, the main takeaway we have from this research is that regulatory space, so that is incumbent on public stakeholders, and of course what academic networks could do. It's also very useful for encouraging IPv6 uptake.
Thanks, Kevin.
Good morning. Andre Griffith. I'm a member of the Barbados ICT Professionals Association. I think I've heard some of the benefits coming out on the IPv6, but I want to engage you in terms of your mind. I know you're doing a research project. You said to help Caribbean governments kind of champion this cause. I want to know what are the benefits. You know, if you have any ideas of what type of benefits that you think Caribbean governments are going to jump on this bandwagon and be able to champion your cause. There's so many other causes in ICT that you would really love governments to champion too, but I'm wondering how IPv6, how you're going to, what a basic of this strategy. I know you can't go into details, you have to research it. I think you have done the research, but you have to bring government into it. Just want to understand from your perspective.
Kevin, before you answer that, it's interesting the way Andre posed the question, because he said, champion your cause. And that's part of the issue, because we still don't see it as something that we have to do, even as stakeholders and citizens, that it is an issue that is facing all of us. We still see it as your cause. So you need to really look at that.
Thanks, Andre. Thanks, Claire. And I love how you labeled it as my cause, my personal burden to bear and to preach this message before you. I'm going to switch hats a bit and go back to other competencies of mine. When we think about competitiveness and sources of competitiveness at this point, the Caribbean cannot really compete on export-led strategies. We cannot compete. We are outnumbered in trying to compete on production capacity. Where we can compete is at the high-end value. And what we are seeing from a competitive landscape is that this high-end value comes from niches and comes from particular skills that could occur. IPv6 supports efficiency across your traditional sectors, including what is very common here in the Caribbean, tourism. It's through that efficiency that we can really begin to see where this becomes very crucial to the monetary value this brings to our economies. And it is very difficult for us to stand here and say that we don't see the need per se, because our traditional economies are being affected at this very time. Tourism is taking a certain hit in the Caribbean, and it's not a situation that will simply rise by no action whatsoever. So there is one of the key areas. Let's take, for instance, the impact of the sharing economy on the Caribbean. We all have Airbnb across the Caribbean being available. We have Uber. We have a lot of these sharing economy models that are in our environment. And we have seen, especially LACNIC has seen across forums, that there is always this friction between the traditional sectors and then the digital actors that are coming on board. How are we really going to reconcile these things? Are we going to pretend that this cannot happen here and therefore block every digital service that comes into our space? Or do we want to create an environment where we can actively think about how these intermediaries affect our space? And we could also think about promoting our own indigenous internet services. There are companies like Uber that have been in existence in Trinidad for a long time. But for some reason, they haven't gotten the prominence of Uber, and now there are questions as to what to do to address this issue. So there are those questions that really need to be addressed if we're looking at our economic survival here in the Caribbean. And I think it's always a translation issue. I don't think I have anybody to convert here at CaribNOG. I'll go back to the point I made yesterday, when you really have to socialize these concepts outside of just the technical-minded folks and get other people involved. So it's not about our cause for their purposes. It concerns all of us, and they will be able to better recognize how we contribute to that scenario. So I hope that provides some sort of response to what your concern is. I'm not saying it's easy. Mm-hmm. If it were easy, then I wouldn't be here. So.
Okay, I mean, thank you very much. That was a pretty much best way you can answer, and that's good. I just want to throw a little spanner in the wheel. Probably completely off the topic, but you mentioned shared economies, like, you know, you talking about the Uber. You mentioned what's the other one you mentioned? Can't remember. But there's also Bitcoin, blockchain, especially with financial resources. That is I don't hear it much addressed, especially in these network. But sorry, I'm not that involved that much. So I would be, it's just me, you know. But probably it's being addressed. But I think that's also another tool that you can add to your whole arsenal. That, you know, we need to have resources. We need people to be independent. We need people to be able to have freedom across borders, and we in the Caribbean cannot be isolated to the world. So that's just a suggestion.
Thank you, Andre, for that. And that's a good note for us to take a break, because at that session, Andre could continue the discussions, not just with Kevon, but others in the room who may share his interests. And I also want to thank you so much, Kevon, for this presentation. Please continue to engage him, and remember, 5 o'clock this afternoon, Lime time. That's when we meet and, you know, talk to each other more, interact, and further some of these discussions. So we take a half-an-hour break, and we return for another remote presentation, and this one would be by Mark Costas of AREN. So we had one registry, LACNIC, just now, and when we come back, we'll hear from AREN after the break. So thank you all, and see you in half an hour.